16%. That's how much of your income the federal government took in 1913 if you made over $500,000. For everyone else, nothing. Zero federal income tax. America had operated for 137 years without taxing its citizens' wages directly. Then, in the span of just 8 months, everything changed. The 16th Amendment passed. The Federal Reserve was born, and the IRS was created to enforce a system that most Americans didn't vote for and many didn't even understand. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The architecture wasn't about fairness. And the real beneficiaries weren't the American people. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed history and hidden power structures every week. Now, let's go back to 1913 and see what actually happened. To understand why the IRS exists, you need to understand what America looked like before it. From 1776 until 1913, the federal government funded itself almost entirely through tariffs and excise taxes. You bought imported goods, the government took a cut. You purchased alcohol or tobacco, taxed, but your wages, your labor, your income, untouchable. The founding fathers were crystal clear about this. Direct taxes on income were considered tyrannical, a violation of individual liberty, and explicitly limited by the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 made it nearly impossible for the federal government to impose direct taxes without apportioning them among the states based on population. This wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. They had just fought a war against a government that taxed them without representation. They weren't about to recreate that system on American soil. Thomas Jefferson himself warned about the dangers of central banking and direct taxation. He understood that whoever controls the money controls the nation. And for over a century, America operated without a central bank and without an income tax. The government was limited. Citizens kept the fruits of their labor. And the country not only survived, it thrived. In fact, America experienced its greatest period of industrial growth and innovation during the era when there was no income tax and no Federal Reserve. The railroads were built, the telegraph was invented, entire cities rose from nothing, all without the government taking a cut of every worker's paycheck. So what changed? Why did a system that worked for 137 years suddenly need to be completely dismantled? But by the early 1900s, that philosophy was under attack. The Industrial Revolution had created massive concentrations of wealth. Robber barons like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan controlled entire industries. And a growing progressive movement argued that the only way to fund a modern government and redistribute wealth was through a federal income tax. The problem? The Constitution stood in the way, so they changed it. In 1909, President William Howard Taft and a Republican-controlled Congress proposed the 16th Amendment. It was sold to the public as a tax on the ultra-wealthy, a way to make the richest Americans finally pay their fair share. The amendment's language was deceptively simple. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. 36 states ratified it by February 1913. But here's where the official story starts to crack. Several states that supposedly ratified the amendment had serious procedural issues. Ohio's vote, for example, wasn't even properly certified. Other states made changes to the amendment's wording before ratifying it, which should have invalidated their approval under constitutional law. Secretary of State Philander Knox declared it ratified anyway. To this day, legal scholars and researchers argue that the 16th Amendment was never lawfully ratified, but by the time anyone questioned it, the machinery was already in motion. The evidence is damning when you actually look at it. Kentucky voted on the amendment on February 8, 1910, but the state didn't officially exist as a state under the Constitution at that time due to unresolved boundary disputes. Oklahoma's legislature wasn't even in session when the supposed ratification vote took place. Tennessee's constitution explicitly prohibited the state legislature from ratifying any amendment that would allow the federal government to tax its citizens directly, yet Tennessee's ratification was counted anyway. When researcher Bill Benson investigated the ratification process in the 1980s, He travelled to every state capital and examined the original documents. What he found was shocking. In state after state, the ratification votes were either improperly conducted, contained altered wording, or were outright fraudulent. He published his findings in a book called The Law That Never Was. The government's response? They ignored it. Because acknowledging the evidence would mean admitting that the entire federal income tax system is built on a lie. Just 9 months after the 16th Amendment was declared ratified, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913. This law established the first peacetime federal income tax and created the foundation for what would become the Internal Revenue Service. The tax rate started at 1% on incomes over $3,000 and topped out at 7% on incomes over $500,000. For context, $3,000 in 1913 is equivalent to about $90,000 today. Most Americans didn't make anywhere near that amount. The median household income in 1913 was around $750, so the vast majority of the population owed nothing. This wasn't a tax on the people, it was a tax on the wealthy elite. At least, that's what they said. But something else happened in 1913 that almost no one connects to the income tax. In December of that year, just weeks after the Revenue Act passed, Congress created the Federal Reserve, a private central banking system given the power to control America's money supply. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Federal Reserve wasn't a government entity, it was a consortium of private banks. And those banks needed a way to ensure the government could pay back the money it borrowed from them. Enter the IRS. Because what good is lending money to a government if that government has no reliable way to collect revenue? The Federal Reserve Act was passed on December the 23rd, 1913, right before Christmas, when most members of Congress had already left Washington for the holidays. The vote took place with minimal debate and almost no public awareness. The bill was over 1,500 pages long. Most of the congressmen who voted for it never read it. And the meeting that designed the entire system, that happened in secret 2 years earlier on Jekyll Island, Georgia. 7 men, all bankers, all representing the wealthiest financial interests in the world. No government officials, no elected representatives, just 7 bankers deciding how America's money system would work for the next century. The names? Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, Paul Warburg, and Benjamin Strong. These men represented J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild, and Kuhn Loeb interests. They created the Federal Reserve to centralize control of American currency, and they needed the IRS to exist simultaneously so the government could tax citizens to pay the interest on the debt the Federal Reserve would create. The Federal Reserve gave the government the ability to print money and go into debt. The IRS gave the government the ability to extract wealth directly from its citizens to pay that debt back. These two systems were designed to work together. One created the debt, the other collected the payment. And the timing of their creation, both in the same year, both under the same administration, wasn't an accident. Now let's talk about enforcement. In its early years, the income tax was relatively simple. You filed a return. You calculated what you owed based on a basic formula. Most people didn't even need to file. But World War I changed everything. The war required unprecedented levels of funding, and the income tax became the government's primary revenue source. By 1918, the top tax rate had skyrocketed to 77%. The 1% tax on modest incomes, gone. Now middle-class Americans were paying too. And the IRS, which started as a small office within the Treasury Department, began expanding rapidly. More agents, more audits, more enforcement. But here's what's rarely discussed. The IRS doesn't just collect taxes. It enforces compliance through fear. The agency has the power to seize your wages, your bank accounts, your property, all without a court order. It can impose penalties and interest that compound faster than most people can pay. And if you refuse to comply, prison. The IRS operates with a level of authority that no other government agency possesses. It's not bound by the same due process protections that apply in criminal court. You're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. The burden of proof is on you, not them. And that's by design, because the IRS isn't just a tax collection agency. It's a control mechanism. It tracks your income, your spending, your investments, your donations. It knows where you work, who you work for, how much you make, and what you do with that money. Every transaction you make, every dollar you earn, it all flows through a system that the IRS monitors. And if you step out of line, they have the power to destroy you financially. Think about what that means. The IRS has access to your bank statements, your credit card transactions, your mortgage payments, your stock portfolio. They know if you donated to a political campaign. They know if you bought gold or cryptocurrency. They know if you're paying child support or receiving disability benefits. Every aspect of your financial life is visible to them. And in recent years, that surveillance has expanded dramatically. The IRS now has the authority to require banks to report any account with more than $600 in annual transactions. That's not a typo. $600. They want to track every transaction, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant. Because control isn't just about collecting taxes. It's about knowing everything. And once they know everything, they can use that information to target, intimidate, and silence anyone who threatens the system. Now, if the IRS was truly about fairness, you'd expect the wealthiest Americans to pay the highest effective tax rates. But that's not what happens. The ultra-rich don't pay income tax the way you do. They pay capital gains tax, which is significantly lower. They use offshore accounts, tax shelters, and corporate structures to minimize their liability. Meanwhile, the middle class, the people who can't afford expensive accountants and lawyers, they pay the highest effective rates. The system wasn't designed to redistribute wealth from the top down. It was designed to extract wealth from the middle and funnel it upward. And here's the part that connects to the bigger picture. The creation of the IRS in 1913 didn't happen in a vacuum. That same year, the Federal Reserve was established. That same year, the Rockefeller Foundation was created, giving the wealthiest family in America tax-exempt status to control education, medicine, and public policy. That same year, the Anti-Defamation League was founded. All of these institutions, all in 1 year, all designed to centralize power, control information, and manage the population. If you think that's a coincidence, you're not paying attention. The IRS was never about fairness. It was about control. It was about ensuring that the government, now permanently in debt to private banks, had a way to extract wealth from the population to pay that debt. It was about creating a surveillance system that tracks every financial move you make. And it was about establishing an enforcement arm so powerful that even the suggestion of an audit is enough to make people comply. So what does this have to do with the suppressed history that nobody talks about? Everything. Because 1913 wasn't just the year the IRS was created. It was the year the old world was officially dismantled and the new control grid was locked into place. The same year they introduced the income tax, they also destroyed the remaining evidence of advanced pre-modern civilizations. The same year they created the Federal Reserve, they also began rewriting history to erase any mention of the sophisticated societies that existed before the mid-1800s reset. The same year they centralized financial control, they also centralized historical narrative control. The IRS is just one piece of a much larger system, a system designed to keep you working, keep you compliant, and keep you from asking the questions that would unravel the entire illusion. Because if you start asking why the income tax was created in the same year as the Federal Reserve, you might start asking what else happened in 1913. And if you start asking what else happened in 1913, you might start noticing the patterns, the world's fairs that displayed technology we supposedly didn't have, the buildings that were supposedly built in months but looked like they took decades, the mudflood evidence buried under every major city, the orphan trains that moved hundreds of thousands of children with no records of their parents, the reset that nobody talks about. The IRS isn't just a tax collection agency, it's a tool used by the same families and institutions that have controlled the flow of money, information, and power for over a century. And the moment you understand that, you understand why they'll never abolish it. Because without the IRS, the entire system collapses, the debt can't be paid, the control can't be maintained, and the illusion can't be sustained. So the next time someone tells you the income tax is about fairness, Ask them why it was created in the same year as the Federal Reserve. Ask them why the wealthiest Americans pay lower effective tax rates than teachers and nurses. Ask them why the IRS has more power than any other government agency. And ask them what else happened in 1913 that we're not supposed to talk about. The answers are there. You just have to be willing to see them. If this opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, there's a video on screen right now that goes even deeper into the 1913 reset. Click it. And if you're serious about understanding how this system really works, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I'll see you in the next one.